This is New Amsterdam Photo Video, and in this video, I'd like to demonstrate how to photograph and edit jewelry, specifically rings. As a product photographer, you come across many types of samples to photograph, and rings have always been tricky due to the reflective nature of the metal. My method is very simple, using only one light and a lot of paper, as well as focus stacking the images to capture the detail of the rings. In this tutorial, I'll go over each step and demonstrate what has worked best for me to create simple jewelry images on white backgrounds for e-commerce. Most rings and jewelry are quite small, so macro lenses are perfect for capturing the fine details. The 100mm 2.8 macro lens is one of my favorite lenses, and perfect for shooting rings despite its very shallow depth of field. The 60mm 2.8 EFS lens is also great if you have a camera with a cropped sensor. When shooting rings, or jewelry in general, it's good practice to clean the samples since the metals can have oils or fingerprints. Rubbing alcohol and a microfiber cloth are perfect for cleaning the shank of the ring as well as the setting area. Q-tips also work well, but be careful not to get any fibers stuck in the setting around the gem. I always use a large whiteboard or piece of acrylic to work on. The larger, the better, since it will reflect in the lower shank of the ring. When shooting reflective objects, look at it from the angle you plan on shooting it from and use your finger to trace what is being reflected. To hold the ring in place, I found that a hot glue gun works best. It's quick and simple to get the ring set into place, and when the glue dries, the hold is very sturdy. This is helpful when you need to make any last-minute touch-ups on the ring to remove any fingerprints. The glue peels off from the metal of the ring easily, leaving no streaks or residue on the metal. Sometimes clients will give floor samples, so it's good practice to not dirty up their samples too much. My lighting setup for shooting rings is extremely simple. I use a large piece of white paper that's rolled into a tube with a small window cut out for the camera. This is perfect for rings since it fills the entire surface, though it is a very low contrast look. I use this setup specifically for shooting a high volume of rings for e-commerce. For high-end editorial work, you actually want to have a nice alternation between the white and the black reflections in the ring. You only need one light with this setup, and I keep a piece of diffusion on the top of the tube to diffuse the light. This setup works well with a softbox or any other modifier you have, but I found using a bare bulb setup works the best, since you may need the harsh light to capture contrast in the gems and composite the gems into the body of the ring later in Photoshop. Since most clients will want their rings shot at various angles, I'll make several tubes with windows in different areas that are suitable to the required angle. When the ring is clean and set in place, frame up on the ring. You can see the dark reflections of the room around the ring before setting the tube down. Once the tube is set in place, there's a nice even fill all around the ring with some highlights coming from the top of the tube. For this standing 45-degree angle, the window is much higher with the camera pointed almost straight down. The shank of the ring is at an angle with the gem slightly off-center. For a front angle, I use this acrylic earring stand to glue the ring onto. I've found that the front angles are easier to do on a stand, so I don't have to position the camera with the lens pointed straight down. The stand is tilted back with a few erasers to keep it in place. Once you frame up on the ring, place down the tube. The window in this tube is a lot lower, which works with the tilted angle of the stand, so there's no dark spots on the inner shank of the ring at all. For side angles, I use a tube with a window on the very bottom, which looks like a mouse hole. Sometimes with this setup, a small white card will be needed to catch some of the dead-on reflections of the shank. This also works well with other side angles, leaving a very small reflection of the camera in the shank. Since the rings are typically very small and the macro lens has a very shallow depth of field, focus stacking is a necessity. Focus stacking is taking a series of images at different focus distances and using software to merge the images together to make a fully in-focus image. You can use a focus stacking rail that physically moves the camera back and forth to take the series of images, but I found that turning the focus ring on the lens works just as well. You can do this easily by hand, but you want to make sure there's no camera shake from touching the lens. I prefer to shoot tethered and use the camera tether software to move the focal plane. I like using f8 or f11 to shoot each image, since that is typically the sharper aperture range of most lenses. If you use a smaller aperture, like f/22, you'll have a deeper depth of field, but the diffraction caused by the small aperture can reduce the overall sharpness of the image. When shooting for a focus stack, I like to start at the very front of the object and work my way back. Using the Canon EOS utility software, I can move the focal plane at small increments and take a picture at each increment. It's best to think of focus stacking as scanning the object, capturing the sharpest and most in focus area of each part of the object. Typically with rings, I'll end up with anywhere between 6 to 10 images, depending on how big the ring is and how much detail I want to capture in the shank. Once the series of images is set, I like to batch edit the raw images to do some very minor exposure, contrast, and white balance adjustments. I recommend not touching the clarity sliders or adding any sharpness at this point, so any dust or blemishes on the metal are not made more obvious. Once the raw adjustments are done, save the images in a TIFF or PSD format. I found that focus stacking the raw files can be slower than using a TIFF format. There's a lot of good focus stacking software options available, like Helicon, but it's actually very easy to do in Photoshop. With Photoshop open, go to the file and look for the Scripts tab. Select Load Files into Stack. In this window, you can browse to look for the image files that you want to merge. Find the folder containing the files and select all the images, and press OK. Make sure you check the box on Attempt to automatically align source images, which will make small adjustments to the images to make them perfectly align. This is particularly useful if you shot the stack by hand and there are any micro movements between shots. Photoshop will process the images and load them all into layers. Clicking through the layers, you can see each individual area of the ring that is in focus. The software will take each portion and stitch them together. Select all the layers and go to Edit and look for the Auto Blend Layers tab. In this window, select Stacked Images and make sure you have Seamless Tones and Colors selected, which fixes any minor exposure changes between shots. Press OK, and the software will scan each image looking for the sharpest areas and stitch them together. Once Photoshop is done stitching, it'll make a merged layer on the top with all the images stitched together. You can see the ring is fully in focus and looks a lot better. Beneath the merged layer, each layer has a layer mask utilizing the sharpest part of each image. If there's any blurry areas that the software could not stitch, you can manually adjust the layer masks to bring the most in focus area of the ring. I found that most photo stitching softwares have trouble with overlapping areas, so there will be a soft blur. This is easily remedied by adjusting the layer masks or just using the clone stamp to stamp over the blurred areas. Now that we have a nice sharp image of the ring, it's time to start editing. When I edit, the first step is to cut out the ring and place it on a white background. Making a path is similar to tracing something on a piece of paper or cutting something out with an X-Acto knife. I prefer making a path using the pen tool. Using the pen tool does take practice, but it is very easy to master. Press P to use the pen tool and pick an area on the outside of the ring to start a path. When you left mouse click, it creates an anchor point to start the path. Click again somewhere along the edge of the ring to make a second anchor point, which is connected to the first point with a segment. When you make an anchor point, you can hold the left mouse button and drag to alter the shape of the segment, which allows you to trace the ring accurately. When you click and drag an anchor point, there are two arms that protrude from the anchor point. One allows you to change the line segment connecting to the anchor point, and the other allows you to change the next segment it'll connect to. To make changes to an anchor point that you've already created, just hold Alt or Option on Mac to click and drag that anchor point to make changes to the segment. I typically like to make two anchor points and create a third point in the middle of the segment, and then use Control or Command on Mac to drag the anchor point. This allows me to drag the segment around. There's no limit to the amount of anchor points you can make, but you do not need to make them too close together. Some parts of the ring are very easy to make segments on, like the stones. Since they're straight angles, you only need to click along each corner. Curved areas take more practice, since you need to alter the segment. For the shank of the ring, you only need a few anchor points and very long segments, since it is one large curve. Keep creating anchor points and segments around the ring until you reach the first anchor point to close the path. When the outer path of the ring is complete, go to the Path window to see your work path. Have the work path selected and click the hamburger symbol or the 3 horizontal lines and select Save Path. You can name your path whatever you want, but I like to leave the outer path as Path 1 in case I do any actions on a large batch that require selecting the paths. With the outer path created and saved, deselect Path 1 and start making a new path on the inner area of the ring. If you're newer to Photoshop, then using the pen tool to make paths can seem like a lot of work, but it's actually very simple once you get the hang of using the tool. To cut out the ring onto the white background, some people may want to use the magic wand tool or make a layer mask and manually paint out the background. While these techniques work, I find that making a path is the most efficient since it'll slice out everything completely outside the object, so there are no leftover pixels that can mess up trimming the canvas. You can also save paths for future use, which is the biggest benefit to making paths. Pathing an object like a ring takes me only a few minutes, but it's something to factor in when photographing large volumes of jewelry. This can add editing time to each image and can compound to several extra hours in post-processing. There are pathing services available where you deliver your images and they send them back next day with paths created. I typically use these services to save time when I have hundreds of images to edit and integrate their cost into my price. Many of these pathing services are overseas, so you can get each image cut out for less than $1 per image, depending on the volume and your negotiating skills. With the ring fully pathed, it's time to put it on a white background. I like to make a new layer and keep it on top of all of my other layers. Select both paths and select the outline circle symbol in the path window to turn the paths into a selection. Next, press the rectangle with a circle symbol to create a layer mask on the layer. The layer mask will hide anything that is outside of the selection. Press Shift and F5 to open the fill window and fill the layer with white. The ring is now isolated on a white background, and having the white layer on the top is very helpful since it'll hide anything below it so you don't have to make a layer mask on each individual layer. Since this ring is costume jewelry, it's a plated metal and not real gold, so there's a lot of tarnish marks on the shank of the ring that'll need to be edited out. Many people's first instinct will be to use the clone stamp, healing brush, or spot healing tools, but I found that using the brush set to 0% hardness at a light opacity around 30% works the best and the fastest. I'll create a new layer and set the blend mode to lighten. Use Alt or the Option key on Mac to sample a gold color from the ring and start painting along the shank. Using the lighten blend mode is perfect for cleaning this ring, since all of the tarnish is a very dark, almost black color, so it'll fill it in perfectly. When using the lighten blend mode, it won't cover any areas that have a higher luminance or are brighter than the color you selected. This will prevent the highlights from getting painted over while covering the dark, unwanted spots. When using this method, I always aim for one color that is brighter than the dust spots but darker than the highlights, and use it to paint over the entire area. After a quick pass over the worst areas of the ring, it's already looking much better. The point of this layer is to be a quick fix layer to target the most unsightly areas of the ring. I'll also use this layer to target the spots and dirt on the settings and other areas of the ring. For the very heavy dark spots, I'll use the brush at 100% opacity. Other spots have a gradient from the highlight to the normal tone, so I'll use a brush at 30% and alternate between the highlight and the normal tone to create a natural looking gradient between the two. It's really important to keep some highlights so the ring retains some contrast and does not look too flat. I like to jump around the image to get the most obvious spots instead of going too into detail in one area. I found this works best so one area does not look too clean compared to the rest of the ring. The amount of time you spend retouching should factor into your price, and you should always discuss this with the client. I've had some clients who prefer the shots straight out of the camera just on a white background with some light corrections, and others who want heavily edited images. It's important to leave some of the detail on the shank as well, so there's some definition between the outer shank and the inner area. For the inside of the shank, I like to keep the middle brighter with more of a highlight than the sides so it doesn't look entirely flat. Again, I like to select the brighter color and the darker color and brush back and forth at a low opacity to create a natural gradient between the two, alternating between the colors. Using the same lighten layer, I'll also target some of the unsightly dark spots in the stone. When using the brush tool, just follow what's naturally there and smooth out the details. Select the highlight areas and brush away the dark spots, but be aware of the lines in the stone and don't paint over them. There can be cracks and spots in the stone, so it's important not to ignore them completely. There can also be hair and dirt in the settings around the stones, so just pay very close attention to anything that might look out of place. I've reached a good stopping point with the lighten layer, so I'll add some noise to the layer to make it look more natural. Go to Filter, and go to Noise, and click the Add Noise tab. I like to use a low percentage at 1% or less. I do keep an action binded to F7 that applies noise at 0.5% to the current layer, and I'll press it a few times to add the right amount of noise when I'm done with a layer. Typically, my lighten layer is just a quick pass, and then I make a second layer for more in-depth refinements. On this layer, I'll be using the brush tool at 10 to 30% opacity, as well as the clone stamp tool at a low opacity. I'll focus more on the stones, fixing any cracks or other unsightly marks and work through them one at a time. The darker areas in the stone will be filled with a low opacity brush that selected the dark color. It's important for the stones to have contrast and not be pure white or blown out, so you want to enhance the darker areas as well as the lighter areas. On the metal of the ring, I'll use the clone stamp tool to remove any additional marks and to fix the highlights on the edges of the shank. Using the brush tool, I'll select the color of the shank to smooth out some of the rough highlights left over from the tarnish that the lighten layer did not clean up, and to add some color to the desaturated portions in the inner shank. With a small brush with 0% hardness, I'll refine the edges of the shank and smooth them out so they're not as rough but still have definition. These are important areas so the ring doesn't look like a formless blob. For this kind of retouching, I bounce between the clone stamp and brush tools. The clone stamp is perfect for continuing lines or repeating patterns, and the brush tool is better for smoothing out entire areas. The brush tool is also perfect at a low opacity to lightly cover blemishes and spots rather than remove them entirely. If you're familiar with makeup, it's best to think of it like a concealer. I prefer these over the healing tool since I found in my experience I go back and forth with the undo keys a lot when using the healing tool. It's a very powerful and helpful tool, but I find I have to clean up a lot of what it's cleaning up more often. The amount of time you spend retouching is really up to you. You can spend hours going over every meticulous detail, but in my opinion, it's okay to leave very minor blemishes behind to keep the sample looking real. With this ring, I feel I've made enough progress cleaning and smoothing out the metal, especially when toggling the layers on and off to compare the before and after. With the cleaning finished, it's time to color the ring. Most jewelry manufacturers will have a style guide that features a color guide for each of the metals they use in their jewelry. This is extremely helpful in having complete color consistency across all images. Since this is a gold ring, we'll use the yellow gold Pantone 7403. Coloring the ring is a very simple task that utilizes a layer set to the color blend mode. First, I'll create a new layer and select the gold color. Click on the color selection on the bottom of the toolbar to open the color picker. To access the Pantone colors, go to Color Libraries. To find this color, you want to go to the coded or uncoded Pantone library and scroll for the 7403 gold color. Select this color and press OK. I'll use a large brush and paint over the entire area of the ring. Go to the Blend Mode drop-down menu in the Layers window and select the Color Blend Mode. This will cause the layer to interact with all layers below and change their color to the selected color. Now that the ring is gold, I need to remove some of the gold color from the stones. Select the layer and press the rectangle with a circle symbol to create a layer mask. Select the layer mask and use the brush to paint away the gold color. The layer mask is very simple. Everything that is white in the layer mask is shown in the image, while everything black is hidden. For something like this, I actually find it faster to just brush the mask away instead of making another clipping path. For the gold, I find it looks best between 20 to 40% opacity depending on how the metal was shot and how saturated it looks. Now that the gold color is removed from the stones, I can use the same layer mask to color the stones as well. The style guide I use for editing jewelry also has colors specified for different stone colors, as well as recommended opacities. Since these are white stones, we'll use the white diamond color of Pantone 5405 at 15% opacity. First, I'll select the layer mask of the gold layer that I just created. Right-click on this mask and click on the Add Mask to Selection tab. Next, create a new layer and press the layer mask symbol to create a layer mask on the layer. Since this mask is actually hiding the stones, I'll invert the layer mask by pressing Ctrl-I or Command-I on Mac while selecting the mask to invert it. Now the mask is only selecting the stones and not the rest of the ring. Now go to the color picker and look for the 5405 Pantone color. Paint in this color over the stones and then select the color blend mode. Go to the opacity slider and change the opacity to 15%. You can see that this changes the color of the stones very subtly, but it'll create consistency across all images with white diamonds. Now that the ring has been colored, I'll use the same layer masks to create curves layers to change the exposures on the metal of the ring and the stones themselves. Right-click on the mask of the gold color and press Add Mask to Selection. Then create a curves layer. Do the same to make another curves layer for the stones. Make sure the exposure adjustments are below the color layers so the colors are not changed. For the stones, I'll make an S-curve to increase the contrast on the stones so they pop a bit more. I'll do the same for the metal of the ring, but boost the midtones a bit as well. The best thing about layer masks is that you can continue to use them on other layers to make more adjustments to specific areas of an image, which is particularly helpful for retouching jewelry. Now that I'm done retouching, the last step is to sharpen the image. Sharpening is always best left for last, when all smoothing and retouching is finished, so there's a consistent sharpen on the image. For me, I like to use the high pass filter set to a hard light blend mode. Select the original ring layer and the retouching layers and press Ctrl-J or Command-J on Mac to duplicate the three layers. Then press Ctrl-E or Command-E to merge the three duplicated layers into one. Go to the filter menu and go to the other selection and press the high pass filter. I usually like to toggle this filter to a higher pixel amount so it's a bit over sharpened. So somewhere in the 3.5 pixel range will work fine for this image. Change the blend mode on the layer to hard light. Now, with the opacity slider, you can toggle the layer to find the right amount of sharpness. I like using this method since the layer is always active and it can be toggled or changed at any time. Zoom into the image to look at what the sharpening layer is doing and toggle the opacity until it's just right. Now that the image is done, I'll crop it. In the Image drop-down menu, select Trim and make sure it trims away all sides. This will crop the image to the very edge of the object, and since it's cut out on white, it'll crop out anything that's white. Press Ctrl-Alt-C or Command-Option-C on Mac to open the canvas size window. Select Relative and I'll add 1 inch all around. Now I'll open the canvas size menu again to copy the width of the image and apply it to the height to make it a square image. Most clients prefer their images in a square format, but you can trim and change the canvas size to any ratio you prefer. Now that the image is complete, you can flatten it to reduce the file size or save it with the layers to make adjustments in the future. There is one last adjustment I'd like to make to this image, and that's to fix one of the improperly set stones. Since the ring is symmetrical, I'll select the same stone on the opposite side with the lasso tool. Just drag the lasso tool around the stone. It doesn't have to be perfect. Press Ctrl-C or Command-C to copy the selection, and then press Ctrl-V or Command-V to paste the selection in a new layer. I'll move the selection to the area that I want to place the copied stone. Go to the Edit drop-down menu and go to Transform and select Flip Horizontal. Lower the opacity of the layer to get the stone into place and then place a layer mask on the stone. Invert the layer mask and brush the stone in place. Many rings will have stones out of place or off-center, so you should always pay attention to the details of the sample to correct any errors made in manufacturing. Comparing the original raw image to the final product, you can see that a lot of work goes into making just one jewelry image. If you're considering starting jewelry photography, it's important to take into account the amount of time to shoot and retouch each image, and to price accordingly. When working with large volumes of samples, you want to make sure that you work with your client to have a realistic timeline to turn around images. Your workflow has to be similar to a factory assembly line, so you can quickly set up to shoot each sample and work your way through editing each image. On my best day, I can shoot and edit a few dozen of these images at most, depending on the amount of retouching that is necessary for each image. My best advice would be to do everything you can to get the sample looking perfect in camera before you ever open it up in Photoshop, so you can dramatically reduce retouching time. If you make one small mistake in every image you make, and it takes time to retouch the mistake in each image, the amount of time spent cleaning up simple mistakes compounds into many extra hours of unnecessary work. There are a lot of different methods to shooting this type of photography, and this is what has worked well for me. This is New Amsterdam Photo Video, and if you found this video helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe.